I used to believe that love, real love, was unbreakable. That once you built a life with someone, through shared laughter and whispered promises, nothing could truly shatter it. I was wrong. For years, Thomas and I had what seemed like the perfect marriage. We weren't just lovers, we were partners, best friends. We traveled the world together, spent lazy Sundays wrapped up in each other, and built a home filled with warmth. He knew my fears, my dreams, my favorite childhood memories, and I knew his. Or at least I thought I did. It all changed the moment I needed him the most. I still remember the sterile white walls of the hospital, the beeping machines, the way the doctor's words felt like a hammer to my chest. I had expected Thomas to hold my hand, to reassure me that no matter what happened, we would face it together. Instead, he looked at me with a mixture of fear and discomfort. I can't do this, he had whispered. I thought I misheard him. What do you mean? His hands trembled as he ran them through his hair. I don't think I can stay, Laura. And just like that, my world collapsed. I watched Thomas walk out of that hospital room as if he were merely leaving a dinner party, like what had just happened was nothing more than an uncomfortable conversation he preferred to avoid. I wanted to believe he would come back, that he just needed time to process, to collect himself. But hours turned into days, and his absence became permanent. He didn't call. He didn't text. He simply vanished from my life, like a shadow retreating at dawn. I spent the following weeks in a fog. The illness had drained me, but his betrayal was what truly hollowed me out. At first I convinced myself that he was struggling too, that perhaps he didn't know how to handle the situation. I made excuses for him because the alternative, that the man I loved had abandoned me in my darkest moment, was too painful to accept. Then one evening I got my answer. It was late, and I was sitting by the window watching the rain streak against the glass, when my phone vibrated. A message. Not from Thomas but from a mutual friend. I thought you should know, it read. I saw Thomas today. He's with someone else. Someone else. The words didn't feel real at first. They couldn't be. But as the details followed, the woman's name, the way they laughed together at a cafe as if the world hadn't just fallen apart, I felt something inside me harden. He hadn't just left me. He had moved on. That was the moment the grief turned to something else. Something sharper. I wasn't just going to get over this. No. I was going to make him regret it. Heartbreak is supposed to be passive. You cry, you grieve, you accept. That's what people tell you. That's what the books, the movies, the well-meaning friends say. But I wasn't built for quiet suffering. The first few weeks after Thomas left, I was numb. I went through the motions of daily life, pretending to be okay, forcing smiles at coworkers, answering texts with empty reassurances. But inside, something darker was growing. I wasn't just sad. I wasn't just heartbroken. I was furious. Furious that he had the audacity to walk away like I was nothing. Furious that he got to move on without consequences, while I was left to pick up the shattered pieces of our life. Furious that I had wasted years loving a man who, in the end, had no trouble replacing me. That's when the plan started to take shape. Revenge wasn't about pettiness. It wasn't about stooping to his level. No, this had to be something deeper, something precise. I wanted him to feel what I had felt, to experience that same raw, gut-wrenching pain. But to do that, I had to be smart. I started with something small. First, I reached out to mutual friends, the ones who hadn't completely abandoned me along with him. I made sure they knew my side of the story, every excruciating detail of his betrayal. Not in a way that made me look bitter, no, I was careful. I played the part of the strong, resilient woman who had been wronged but was determined to rise above it. People love a comeback story. Slowly, I watched the shift in their loyalty, the quiet judgment in their voices when they spoke to him, the invitations he once received that never came anymore. The foundation of his social life, the one he had taken for granted, started to crack. But that was just the beginning. Next, I turned my attention to Sophie. Sophie, the woman he had so effortlessly replaced me with. Young, beautiful, hopelessly naive. I could have hated her, but I didn't. She wasn't the real enemy here. She was just another casualty waiting to happen. Another woman Thomas would eventually grow tired of, just like he had with me. She just didn't know it yet. So I decided to help her see the truth. I started with something subtle. A carefully crafted anonymous message sent to her work email. Nothing too dramatic, just a simple, polite inquiry. Does Thomas ever talk about his past relationships? Does he ever mention Laura? No accusations. No details. Just a seed planted in her mind. Then I waited. It took 3 days before she posted something that told me it had worked. A vague, thoughtful caption beneath a picture of a sunset. Funny how people can hide so much. Even from the ones they love. She was doubting him. Good. But doubt alone wasn't enough. The next step was to make sure she heard the full story, from someone she trusted. That's where Thomas's best friend Adam came in. Adam had always been neutral, caught between loyalty to Thomas and the reality of what he had done. He had checked on me a few times after the breakup, though he had never outright condemned Thomas for what happened. That was about to change. I invited Adam for coffee, under the guise of clearing the air. I played my part well, calm, composed, the picture of a woman who had found peace. But when the conversation turned to Thomas, I let my words carry just the right amount of sorrow. I don't hate him, Adam. I just wish he had told me the truth before walking away. Before moving on so quickly. I wish I hadn't found out about Sophie through a friend instead of from him. I saw the flicker of unease in Adam's expression. Guilt. A dangerous but useful emotion. By the time we parted ways, I knew he wouldn't be able to keep what I had said to himself. He would go back to Thomas, ask questions, bring up my name. And Sophie, already burdened with her own doubts, would hear every word. Sure enough, a week later, Thomas's picture disappeared from Sophie's social media. Then came the private posts, cryptic but filled with betrayal. I had cracked the foundation. Now it was time to bring the whole thing down. But this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my power. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't felt since Thomas walked out of that hospital room. Control. And I wasn't going to stop now. Once the cracks started to show, I knew it was only a matter of time before Thomas's perfect little world collapsed. But I wasn't going to leave it to chance. I had worked too hard, suffered too much, to let fate decide how this ended. No, I wanted precision. I wanted to be the architect of his downfall. I wanted him to feel everything. Sophie was already questioning him. I could see it in the way she had started posting less, in the shift from glowing captions about their relationship to more vague, brooding thoughts. Doubt had settled in, but doubt wasn't enough. I needed to push her to the edge. And I knew exactly how to do it. I had held on to something I never thought I would use. A secret. It was an old wound, one I had buried for years, thinking it would never matter. But now it mattered more than ever. Because Thomas had a history of betrayal. Long before he walked out on me, there had been indiscretions. Whispers. Late-night texts I wasn't supposed to see. He had never outright admitted to cheating, but he had come close enough. I had found messages between him and an old coworker. Flirty, suggestive, just enough to make my stomach turn. When I confronted him, he had sworn it meant nothing. That it was just an ego boost, harmless words never meant to go anywhere. I had been naive. I had let it go. But I had kept the screenshots. And now they were my weapon. I created a new email account. No name, no history, just a blank slate. Then I attached the messages, typed out a short, brutal note and hit send. Sophie, I thought you should see this. He did it before. He'll do it again. I imagined her reading it, her heart pounding, her stomach twisting the way mine had all those years ago. I imagined her looking at Thomas, really looking at him, and wondering how much of what he had told her was a lie. And then I waited. It didn't take long. 2 days later, I got confirmation that the damage had been done. A mutual friend messaged me out of the blue. Did you hear? Sophie and Thomas had a huge fight. She kicked him out of her apartment. I almost laughed out loud. I had expected anger, denial, maybe even a public meltdown. But I hadn't expected Sophie to be the one to throw him out. She wasn't as weak as I had thought. And Thomas, oh poor pathetic Thomas, was suddenly homeless. But I wasn't done with him yet. The next step was dismantling the last thing he had left. His reputation. Because if there was one thing Thomas valued above all else, it was the way people saw him. He had always been charming, always the center of attention, always effortlessly admired. But admiration is a fragile thing. And I was about to take it from him. I reached out to people we had known for years, former colleagues, acquaintances, anyone who still saw him as the successful, charming man he pretended to be. I let little things slip in conversation. Not outright accusations, just enough to plant seeds. Yeah, it's crazy how quickly he moved on after leaving me. I guess that's just how he is. I always wondered if there was more to his past relationships. But I guess we'll never know, right? Whispers turned into conversations. Conversations turned into full-blown rumors. And Thomas, the man who had once thrived on his perfect image, was watching it unravel in real time. I knew it was working when I saw the shift. People stopped inviting him to things. His name wasn't brought up in casual conversations the way it used to be. His social media presence, once filled with carefully curated glimpses of his amazing life, became sparse, almost non-existent. And then one night he showed up at my door. It was late. Too late for casual visits. When I opened the door, I barely recognized him. He looked different. Tired. Disheveled. The usual confidence, the smug charm, it was gone. "Laura," he said, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "Can we talk?" I stared at him for a long moment, taking in the man who had once walked out on me without a second thought. The man who had left me to suffer while he built a new life, thinking he would never have to look back. And now here he was, looking back. I should have felt victorious. But instead I just felt done. I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Why?" His jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw something I had never seen before. Regret. Real genuine regret. But regret wasn't enough. "Because I need to say things I should have said before," he admitted. "I know I hurt you. And I know I don't deserve to ask for anything, but..." I held up a hand, stopping him. "You're right," I said simply. "You don't." He blinked. "Laura, please." I shook my head. "I spent months trying to understand how you could do what you did. How you could walk away like I was nothing. And I realized something, Thomas." I met his gaze, my voice steady. "You never deserved me." His shoulders sagged. His expression crumbling in a way I had never seen before. Good. For a moment I thought he might argue. That he might try to spin it the way he always had. But he didn't. He just stood there, silent, the weight of everything finally pressing down on him. And then without another word I shut the door. I didn't watch him leave. I didn't need to. Because I already knew. Thomas was broken. And I had one. It didn't take long before Thomas reached out to me. At first it was subtle. An unexpected text sent late at night. "Hey, hope you're doing okay." I stared at my phone, allowing myself a small, satisfied smile. He was worried. Not about me, of course, but about the life he had so carefully constructed beginning to slip through his fingers. I didn't respond. Not yet. Over the next few days I continued watching from the shadows. Sophie had stopped posting about their relationship entirely, and mutual friends whispered about their sudden coldness toward each other. Then finally, the moment I had been waiting for. Thomas showed up at my door. He looked different. Tired. Less sure of himself. For the first time in years, he wasn't the effortlessly confident man I had once loved. He was a man scrambling to keep control of a situation that was slipping from his grasp. "Laura," he began, offering me a hesitant smile. "I just wanted to check in. We haven't talked in a while." I leaned against the doorway, feigning mild curiosity. "We haven't had much to talk about, have we?" His jaw tightened. "Look, I know things ended badly between us, but I don't want there to be bad blood." Bad blood. As if he had simply forgotten the way he had abandoned me when I needed him the most. As if he hadn't rewritten our entire history to suit his own convenience. I tilted my head, considering him. "And what does Sophie think about you visiting your ex?" Something flickered across his face. Guilt? Anxiety? I couldn't tell. But I knew then that my plan was working. "You talked to her," he said, voice low. I raised an eyebrow. "Should I have?" Thomas exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "She's been acting different. Distant. She keeps asking about you. About us. Maybe she just wants the truth." He frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "I told her the truth." I let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Did you? Did you tell her how you left me in a hospital room? How you never even looked back? Did you tell her that?" Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had nothing to say. because there was nothing he could say. "I think you should leave," I said, stepping back into my apartment. For a brief moment, I saw something I hadn't expected: regret. But regret wasn't enough. Not anymore. I shut the door in his face, and as I leaned against it, my heart pounding, I allowed myself to feel it: victory. But I wasn't finished yet. The days that followed were eerily quiet. No more phone calls. No more texts. It was as if Thomas had simply vanished. I had expected some kind of retaliation. Maybe a final desperate attempt to salvage his image, to twist the story in his favor. But nothing came. And that's when I knew I had broken him. Through whispers from mutual friends, I learned the full extent of the fallout. Sophie hadn't just left him. She had destroyed any chance he had of rebuilding his reputation. Her family, furious and protective, had spread the truth like wildfire. Thomas's co-workers, the ones who had once admired his charm, now looked at him with barely disguised contempt. He wasn't fired, but he might as well have been. His boss, uncomfortable with the scandal surrounding him, quietly started phasing him out of important projects. He wasn't invited to work events. Meetings that once required his presence suddenly carried on without him. His career, once thriving, was now stagnant. And then there was his social life. Thomas had always been good at keeping friends, but friendships are fragile things when built on convenience. With his charm stripped away, his reliability questioned, people started distancing themselves. The invitations slowed. The phone stopped ringing. He was alone, just as I had been. One evening, weeks after our last confrontation, I received a letter in the mail. No return address. Just my name written in Thomas's familiar handwriting. I hesitated before opening it, my heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. Inside was a single page, the words scrawled in hurried, uneven strokes. "Laura, I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve it. But I needed you to know that I understand now. I see what I did to you, what I took from you. I thought I could outrun it, pretend it never happened, but I can't. You made sure of that. I don't blame you for any of it. I just wanted you to know. I'm sorry." There was no signature. I read the letter 3 times before folding it neatly and setting it aside. A part of me had once longed for this, an apology, an acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. But now that I had it, it felt empty. Too little, too late. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel anger. I just felt done. For the first time since he had walked out of my life, I felt truly free. With Thomas's letter tucked away in a drawer, I felt as though I had finally closed the last chapter of that painful part of my life. There was no grand moment of relief, no cinematic feeling of triumph, just a quiet acceptance that the war was over. And I had won. But victories, even the ones we fight hardest for, don't erase the past. They don't make you whole again. In the weeks that followed, I found myself drifting between emotions I didn't fully understand. I wasn't sad, not exactly. I wasn't angry either. What I felt was unmoored. For so long, revenge had been my purpose, my anchor. Now that it was gone, I was left standing in the ruins of the life I had once built with Thomas, wondering what came next. So I started small. I took walks in the mornings, breathing in the crisp air, letting myself exist without expectation. I picked up my old sketchbooks, filling pages with half-finished drawings that were more about the movement of the pencil than the end result. I started saying yes to invitations, to coffee with old friends, to a weekend trip with my sister, to things I had once put off because my life had revolved around someone else. One evening I found myself at a bookstore, wandering between the shelves aimlessly. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but then a voice interrupted my thoughts. "Laura." I turned, and for a moment my heart caught in my throat. It was Daniel. He had been a friend of mine years ago. We had lost touch when I got married, as people often do. But seeing him now, standing there with that same easy smile, it was as if no time had passed at all. "I can't believe it's you," he said, stepping closer. "How have you been?" The question was simple, but I knew there was weight behind it. He had probably heard what had happened, at least in bits and pieces. Gossip traveled fast in circles like ours. I hesitated, then smiled. "I've been finding my way." He nodded, as if he understood exactly what I meant. "Well, if you ever want company on that journey, I'd love to catch up." I surprised myself by saying yes. It started as casual meetups, lunches, late-night conversations over coffee, shared laughter that felt effortless. But somewhere along the way something shifted. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic realization, just a quiet, growing warmth. A comfort I hadn't known I needed. One evening as we sat on a rooftop bar, overlooking the twinkling city lights, he turned to me and asked, "Do you regret it? Everything that happened with Thomas?" I thought about it. Really thought about it. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret what I did. He deserved it. But I do regret ever giving him the power to hurt me in the first place." Daniel reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. "You're not that person anymore." And he was right. I had spent so long defining myself by what Thomas had done to me, by the pain, the anger, the need for revenge. But that wasn't who I was, not anymore. I had taken back control. I had won. And now finally I was ready to live. Months passed, and with each day the ghost of my past faded a little more. The scars Thomas left behind would always be there, but they no longer defined me. I had spent so much time believing that revenge would be the thing to free me, that his suffering would heal my wounds. And in a way it had. But true freedom? That had come when I let go. I didn't check on him anymore. I didn't ask mutual friends how he was doing. Didn't look for his name on social media. Didn't wonder if he was still drowning in the consequences of his actions. Because in the end, Thomas wasn't my problem anymore. I was too busy living. The small moments that I had once taken for granted became my greatest treasures. Morning walks with my coffee, feeling the sun warm my skin. Late-night conversations with Daniel, where laughter came easy and the past felt like nothing more than a distant story. Daniel. He had become an unexpected but steady presence in my life. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, nothing dramatic or all-consuming. And maybe that's why it felt so real. There was no desperate need to fill the emptiness left by Thomas, because for the first time I wasn't empty. I wasn't looking for someone to fix me. I had already done that myself. Still, Daniel was there, and his presence felt like something solid, something I could trust. We took our time, never rushing into definitions or expectations. Some nights we would just sit together in comfortable silence, watching the world go by, and that was enough. One evening as we sat on my balcony with glasses of wine, he looked at me with an expression so open, so genuine, that it made my heart ache in the best way. "You seem happy," he said. And for the first time in a long time I didn't have to think about my answer. "I am." The woman I had been a year ago wouldn't have believed it. That version of me had been lost, broken, consumed by anger and hurt. She had needed revenge to make sense of her pain, to find her way back to herself. But I wasn't her anymore. I had learned that revenge could be satisfying, but it wasn't a foundation to build a life on. Eventually you had to step forward to create something new instead of clinging to the ruins of the past. The last piece of my closure came unexpectedly. It happened on a rainy afternoon when I least expected it. I had been running errands, caught up in the normalcy of my day, when I saw him. Thomas. He was sitting alone at a cafe, his shoulders hunched slightly, his expression drawn and tired. The confident, untouchable man I had once loved was gone. In his place was someone smaller, someone who looked as though he had been left behind by the world. He hadn't seen me. For a moment I considered walking past, pretending he didn't exist. But instead I hesitated, then turned and walked into the cafe. Not toward him. I had nothing left to say, but toward the counter to order a coffee. As I waited for my drink, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked different, not just in the way I held myself but in the way I felt. Lighter, stronger, whole. Thomas glanced up then, his gaze drifting absent-mindedly around the cafe, and for a brief moment our eyes met. I saw the flicker of recognition, the momentary shock. But I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply looked at him the way I would look at a stranger on the street, because that's what he was now. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something. But before he could, my name was called, and I turned to grab my coffee. I didn't look back as I walked out the door, because for the first time in a long time I truly didn't care. The past was behind me, and as I stepped into the open air, feeling the first drops of rain on my skin, I knew one thing for certain. I had won. The end.